Hello, good morning, everybody. I think we have a big waiting room of people who are gently coming in. Hello, everybody. My name is Sam Fankhauser. I'm director of the Grantham Research Institute at LSE, the London School of Economics. I'm also the PI of the Place-Based Climate Action Network, PCAN, which is processing the COP26 fellowships, but doesn't have all that much to do with them otherwise. I will tell you something about PCAN and the process in a second. Let me also introduce the other two main resource people who will be able to answer your questions. We have Lizzie Hinchcliffe from ESRC, UKRI ESRC. Don't know whether you can see her, but in my screen she's on the top left. And we have Alyssa Gilbert from the Grantham Institute at Imperial College. And Alyssa is running a COP26 network of universities, which we hope will be the sort of the host and the support structure for the fellowships we are able to award, courtesy of Lizzie really, and courtesy of UKRI. So the plan for this hour is that we say a few sort of contextual preliminary things. We then have already a lot of questions that various people in various ways have submitted to us already. We will go through those, or the main ones of those, which will give you time to formulate your own questions. We then want to have a lot of time for your own questions. You can either use the chat function if you have a question, or raise your hand. I'm sure we're all familiar with the way Zoom works by now. So that'd be the way in which you can get my attention. If you don't get it, just shout at some point. I suggest we split those questions into two blocks just to have a bit of structure in it. There will be a first block, which is about content and, you know, what should fellowships do, what sort of questions are interesting, what sort of approaches are possible, and so on. And then there's a whole set in the second block more on procedural issues about budgets and timelines and eligible expenses and all those sorts of things. So that's the plan, and I've spoken long enough to make sure everybody's in the room. There's now 60 of us, which is great. So let me say something about the COP26 fellowships. It's really a conversation we've had with ESRC and EPSRC for a long time. There was a big appetite from the research councils to be helpful to the COP26 process, and the way this was ultimately structured is that the UKRI through EPSRC and ESRC has made available £400,000 for a series of fellowships. We decided that would be something in the order of 4 to 6, but that's all subject to the budgets that everybody submits. And those fellowships should be across sort of all disciplines. So this isn't just EPSRC and ESRC disciplines. It can be all natural sciences, could even be arts, humanities, social sciences, engineering. We're interested in the breadth of all disciplines. But we are also interested particularly in work that is in one way or another relevant to COP26, or more broadly to the international climate negotiations. Obviously COP26 is the hook, but COP26 is one of a whole series of international milestones in the negotiations, and we would like people to engage through COP26 more broadly with those negotiations. So that's the ambition. We don't have any preconceived views as to the experience or seniority of the fellows. We are keen, or ESRC and EPSRC are keen on early career researchers, but not exclusively. It can be senior experienced researchers as well. So it's really very broad. All disciplines are in, all levels of seniority are in. The main constraint is that it has to be relevant in one way or another to the COP26 process. The other constraint is it's a 1 year roughly affair. The program runs until November next year. COP, as you know, is in the first half of November. Now, first half of November 2021. So it will run for a year roughly and until November 2021. So people have to submit proposals that are feasible within that time frame. And obviously, the more productive amongst you can collect primary data and do primary research, the sort of people with normal productivities will probably sort of focus on engagement, synthesis, translation, maybe a little bit of primary data collection. So that's roughly the ambition and the idea behind the fellowship. The other thing I should say is it is linked to a network of universities that already exists, that is run out of Imperial College by Alyssa Gilbert. And the idea is that we will embed those 4 to 6 fellows into that network. And Alyssa, why don't you tell us what exactly we mean by that and what on earth your network actually does?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Sam. Quite rightly, many of you and many people interested in this fellowship have asked about the universities network, because while we mention it in the fellowship, it doesn't have a website, so it's difficult to dig around and find out information about it. So I'll give you a quick introduction. When it became clear sometime last year that the UK was likely to host COP26, several of the specialist climate change units at universities came together in a grassroots way and suggested that we should make sure that universities punch above our weight and achieve more than we could do as just the sum of our parts by creating a group of universities who can help support the COP26 presidency in the UK, but also, make use of our great academic resources, as well as what we can achieve by being universities with campuses and students and educational ability all around the country. So that was started sometime in September last year. And at this point, we now are quite an informal grassroots network of over 30 universities in the UK that's made up of lots of academics at all sorts of different levels. The network itself also has been developing and grown really good, close relationships with particularly the central COP26 Cabinet Office team. And that allows us to help share our academic knowledge and expertise with them to influence and support and guide their agendas that they want to achieve for COP26. But it also gives us the opportunity to use COP26 as a leverage point to try and make the UK do better on its climate change mitigation and adaptation goals. The network is pretty informal, but we've also set up a whole set of streams of activities that reflect the things that think we can achieve as a universities community. Some of those involve targeted and very strategic briefing papers or notes. They're quite short. We published one on COVID and climate, which you might be able to find. That's our first output. And the idea is that as a group, we can really hone the minds of those key policymakers and decision makers and provide the UK government with material that it can spread whilst it's developing its COP26 strategy to influence governments internationally. We have activities then around these targeted pieces of information and briefing papers, but we now also have subgroups working on public engagement on climate change, and that will be for the UK, but also possibly internationally. We have activities to help us link up to universities, particularly in the partner lead country, Italy, but also in other parts of the world. We have activities related to general communications and amplifications of messages. We have a subgroup that's working on engagement directly with other policy and decision makers at local government and national level, and a whole number of activities beside. As I said before, and we're also going to have a website hosted at the University of Glasgow and specific activities to engage proactively with media and be responsive easily to local, national, and international media who want to access academic expertise between now, during COP, and also hopefully beyond to create some kind of legacy. So we're an informal network. We've got some structures in place. And what we hope to do in this connection with these fellows is develop a closer and stronger connection to these 4 to 6 areas of research and priority, and use this network that we have to amplify and ensure that we have impact as much as possible. The network will be able to offer some kinds of support because, as I said, we have this structure, we have lots of good contacts, but we're not going to be able to sort of design an event for you, for example. So it'll be an evolving thing. As part of this fellowship, there's also going to be someone who's hired to work very part-time, but as a liaison between the fellows and the COP26 Universities Network to help everybody get the most out of that relationship. So I'll stop there, and if there are more questions about the network and how that might work, we can discuss it in the rest of this session.
Okay, thanks, Alisa. So basically, this is a great opportunity, I think, for somebody who wants to engage with international climate negotiations for a year or so, and has sort of a ready-made structure of engagement and support to attach themselves to. So that's the hope anyway, and the aspiration. Just a quick word on PCAN. I know some of you have wondered. PCAN is an ESRC-funded Network Plus. It stands for the Place-Based Climate Action Network. It's really all about the place-based action in the UK at the subnational level. So it's not particularly relevant at all to COP26, although subnational activities are relevant to COP. But PCAN, in a sense, we are mostly the sort of the conduit. We have a small grants program. We're therefore able to structure bids like the one we're initiating here. And I think we were selected mostly because of our abilities to do that rather than a big content overlap between COP26 and what PCAN has. Okay, so those are the preliminary sort of remarks. Let's now start with the Q&A session, part 1. And part 1, as I suggested, is questions about content and methodologies and the substance of the fellowship. I will start with the ones we've accumulated, just to give you time to gather your thoughts and formulate your own questions. Again, you have the chat function to do that, or you can raise your hand if you have a question. So the first one that we already have is a question about the focus of fellowships. Is this UK oriented? Is it internationally oriented? If it is international, are there particular geographies that we are more interested in than others? Europe, for example, or Annex 1 countries, or something like that. The answer is it's COP26, and therefore it's international. Obviously, we're working particularly closely with the UK hosts, as Alisa has mentioned. So our main way in, as it were, and our main interactions are with the UK COP26 office. But we have people on the team who work with the UNFCCC. So we have that international link to the Secretariat of the Convention. We would welcome fellowships that, go broader, isn't just supporting the UK host, but might support other parties to the convention and other parties in the process. The one thing I would say, though, is that we are not particularly interested in sort of individual countries or particular technologies or particular countries. The NDC of China is probably a bit too narrow, important though that is. We do want to have that international feel. So that is my take at answering the focus question. I don't know, Alisa, whether you want to add something to that.
No, I think that was a good summary. I think that there's a lot of people who I've seen individual questions about, can I have a fellowship just on this very specific narrow area? And I think you have to make the case that it's really important that this be explored as part of COP26. So obviously there are lots of things that are discussed that may be really relevant to the direction of international agreements that might not be in the detailed letter of the COP26 negotiations. I think those topics, if they're strategic, are things that you can argue well that would make part of this fellowship, but you do have to be able to make that connection.
Okay, there's two questions here. One about whether you can take the fellowship with you, which I parked for the second, more processy set of the Q&A. The other one is, does Italy have a similar fellowship program? Not that I'm aware of, but Alyssa, you might know better.
No, not that I know of either.
So this is, again, courtesy of UKRI being proactive and engaged. So it's great that we have it, but we're the only ones who have it. So the other three questions that I have that is sort of more content related is what is the audience that we have in mind? If it's a COP26 engagement process, does that mean that fellows will only ever talk to negotiators? The answer to that is no. Obviously, negotiators are a key audience, but there's a sort of the broader UNFCCC stakeholder groups. They're all in scope, and that can include, in answer to a specific question, people who would like to create the sort of a public engagement aspect to COP26 and excite the public about the negotiations or involve the public in the negotiations. So those are all things that are possible. So engagement we would define quite broadly. It can be all those groups. If your proposal is narrowly just for researchers, that probably is too narrow. But in terms of audiences, it could be negotiators, it could be NGOs, it could be the public. All that is possible. And it says grinning for some reason, so let's find out why.
Just agreeing. It's good.
Good.
There's a content question there about Article 6.
Okay. Does the network have any relationship with the IPCC working groups is one of them, and Article 6 of the Paris Rulebook. Article 6 of the Paris Rulebook is in scope in a sense that this is one of the big questions that have to be negotiated at the moment, and that the UK host and the UNFCCC Secretariat agonize about. So this is something that, where you can make, as a fellow, you can make a contribution quite tangibly to the UNFCCC process. So this is actually quite an interesting and relevant topic. Links to IPCC, I'm sure, Alyssa, various people in your network are IPCC authors.
Yeah, we don't have a kind of explicit link directly to IPCC as such, but yes, we have various members of the network are IPCC authors. We have a close relationship with one of the working groups because they're based at Imperial anyway. But that's also something, again, that we can establish or develop further if it's relevant. The network is still relatively new, so I should also say that there's also a lot of space for expanding our engagement potential, and also expanding membership of other universities. So also don't worry if you don't know whether or not anyone at your university is a member of the network. You don't need to worry about that.
Another question here is, does the network sort of provide access to the actual negotiations? I guess the answer to that is no, because that's quite a closed shop. But I don't know, Alyssa, you might have a trick to overcome that.
Well, I would say, yeah, we can't guarantee that at all, but we have had really significant interest from the Cabinet Office COP26 team in these fellowships, and I think they're very keen to be involved and engaged with people who take the fellowships on, especially if the topics align with their priorities and what they need to achieve. We can help support at least you understanding the process of how to get a place, but I think it's going to be hard. We can't guarantee that you get a place at the negotiations, but we can make the contacts that might help you.
Okay, I have another question here while you're formulating your own, which was about focus on COP26 as opposed to the climate negotiations more broadly. Does it have to be specifically COP26, or could there be scope for fellowships that look at the entire negotiation process, starting from wherever you want to start, Berlin in 1995 all the way to Glasgow in 2021, and looking beyond? It doesn't have to be just COP26, but it has to be relevant to the process, the negotiation process in one way or another. So purely historic is probably a bit too academic, but sort of, for example, exploring whether COPs can be designed in a more effective way, sort of looking at COP27 and COP28, that would certainly be interesting. Sort of speculating or exploring how COP and the UNFCCC links to other processes like the G7, G20, all those things I think would be in scope. So COP26 in a sense is an opportunity to get the attention of researchers and the UK hosts and bring them together, but it can be quite a bit broader than just 2 weeks in Glasgow next November.
Yeah, I think you need to be able to answer that question. And so what for the COP26 negotiations? And so what for some kind of audience?
Yeah, actually something that comes later in my script, but it's probably a good point to say it now. In terms of the evaluation, who will look at your proposals? Because the so what obviously is a key part of that. So we will have an interdisciplinary group of mostly academic, sort of usual UKRI type panels. We make sure that they come really from across disciplines. There will be social science representatives, climate scientists on it. We want engineers on it. I think, Lisa, we may or may not have somebody with a health background. We're looking at that at the moment. But importantly, there's also going to be somebody from the COP26 office, and one of my colleagues, Alina Avetchenkova, who will become a fellow herself and sort of play a coordinating role. And Alina used to work for the UNFCCC. So there's people on the panel who will have a very keen eye on what the negotiations are interested in and what is relevant to the negotiations. So the so what that Alisa just mentioned that's really key. Almost anything goes topic-wise, discipline-wise, seniority-wise, but you have to have the so what, and you have to pass that test of the people who are close to the negotiations. Okay, that was meant to come later, but I thought it was a good point to say that now. Somebody asked about, in the document, we have put in a sentence in the call document that talks about the availability of training. And Alisa, you can probably answer that one.
Yeah, we thought actually when we were talking together, some of us, the PI and Sam, about the fellowships, we thought that actually we really wanted to make sure that the people who take on these fellowships either have the potential to or the experience of engaging with different audiences and getting impact from their work, but we wanted to also make sure that this is open to people who may have the potential to do that, but may not have had the experience doing that. So we think it's really likely that when the fellows are chosen, we'll offer access to some kinds of training in the area of taking research into practice. It could be communications training. There's various different types of training that we already run at our institute at Imperial that might well be relevant to supporting the new fellows in achieving the goals of this fellowship. So we can't really be that explicit about what the training would be at the moment, but it's in that kind of space, helping with the impact and the engagement, and supporting the new fellows with the skills that might help them achieve what the objectives are of the fellowship.
Okay, I have a couple of questions here that some of them again I'll park for later and complain if I don't come back to them, but two content questions. yeah, that question about empirical research or research full stop versus engagement and synthesis, what exactly is in scope? I guess the short answer is whatever you can do in 12 months and have meaningful engagement with policymakers on. So I could imagine that can include empirical work. It can include, certainly can include focus group with people close to the negotiation process. It can include surveys, can include things like that. Obviously, there's certain types of research that simply take longer than 12 months, and those wouldn't be feasible. But anything you can do in 12 months really is permissible. So our assumption was that that means a lot of synthesis, but if you want to do primary empirical research, if you can collect data from negotiators, analyze it all in time to have an engagement with the process, that'd be perfectly fine. There's a question here also about a sort of a more deep focused case study to look at particular questions. For example, question of initiating cultural change. Would that be relevant? It can be if you can make it, if you can draw broader lessons for the negotiations. I think that would be the test, I would imagine, in the eyes of the evaluators. Sort of knowing everything about a particular community is great, but if it doesn't have that read across to a question that negotiators or the COP process is grappling with, you probably have a problem. So work very hard at explaining that read across, and then it could work. But Alyssa, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that sounds right to me. I'm just, yeah, sorry, I was just reading some other questions in the chat while you're talking about that. This other one about the balance between, I think it's, well, very similar. If things are relevant to the negotiation process, could they be public engagement projects? How can they be relevant to the negotiation process? I think that's a trickier one.
Or you move that one there. But sure, am I supposed to be telling you what you
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I would say public engagement is very relevant to the UK host. It's probably, I don't know about the international process, but to the UK host, I remember having had one or two conversations where they're keen to sort of make it a sort of a participatory event. They don't want Glasgow to happen behind closed doors. They want the UK public to be aware of it, to be supportive of it, to be excited about it. And if you can package that sort of objective into a meaningful fellowship, then that would sound sort of good to me and eligible to me.
And I think there are also some issues that might not be, again, I think we said this at the beginning, might not be negotiated upon in detail at the negotiations, but are very, very vital to the direction that the negotiations take. And some aspect of public engagement might be important to setting the scene or ensuring that that's well understood. So you can imagine whole areas about just transition or things like that, where that's really part of the direction that negotiations are taking. So again, think through that kind of so what dimension.
Okay, I'm looking at the chat box and I'm looking at my script, I think, and I'm looking at the time. I have the sense that the sort of the content questions are broadly exhausted. If you have more ones, don't be bashful, still ask them. But I suggest we move on to the sort of more process questions of eligibility, of timeframes, of structures, and there's quite a few that are already on the chat box.
Can I just jump in, Sam, and answer one about that refers back to training?
Well, oh yes, please do. Yeah.
Right, and while you pick up the next question you want to answer, there's a question here about should someone articulate which training they think they need in the proposal, I think that's obviously up to you, but as I said before, the purpose of the training is for us to be open to people who feel like they need to complement their existing skill set to be able to deliver what we're asking for the fellowship. So it absolutely will work in your favor if you're painting a picture of yourself and say, here's what I can do, here's what I'd like to do, and here's the kind of training that I think I need to do that. It's not that we can promise to deliver that, but I think it's an appropriate acknowledgement of what you're bringing to the table and what you want to develop. That's perfectly valid. Someone also asked about the video format. I'm going to just pick up that question because that's again relevant to this idea of impact, and that we wanted to be open to people who feel they have a really strong potential to engage and be engaging on their subject matter to a variety of audiences, but might not be able to provide us with a long track record of having done so. And we felt like a purely written on paper application form might not provide that opportunity for people to show that they have that ability. So it's so that we are able to get a feel for the engagement impact side of you.
I think the video is actually a brilliant idea, but it is Alyssa. So if you hate it, Alyssa is the person to complain to. If you love it, as I do, Alyssa is the one to congratulate. Let's look at some of the sort of eligibility questions. We have sort of said that we would expect fellows to have a completed PhD, and there's a fair few questions of what we mean and how that might be flexed. Basically, what we are interested in is people who are sort of bona fide academic researchers. The question, working at a institution that can receive ESRC or EPSRC funding. So that's really what we want. And then the question is, how do you sort of show your bona fides? And one way of saying that is you passed your PhD. So people who are still in receipt of a PhD fellowship that they would have to interrupt, that would just contractually not work very well. But people who are in the process of finishing their PhD, they're looking for their first job, and they see that as an opportunity to land that first job. As long as your university is happy to employ you, you know, on the terms that the fellowship offers, that's fine. So you don't have to have the PhD today, but in a sense, you have to convince your university that they want to give you a job based on your qualifications. Some people have asked people who have master's backgrounds, for example, people who work in labs and so on, and may not have PhDs. Again, that's absolutely possible. You have to convince us that you're an independent-minded researcher and can do a fellowship and all the engagement aspects that come with it as an independent researcher. So that really is the test. The PhD, in a sense, is mostly a way of formalizing these expectations that we are after independent researchers. The question of whether you can take the fellowship with you if people move. Normal UKRI rules apply, and people always take their fellowship to new employers. So that is possible. What we want to know is that at the outset of the fellowship, there's somebody there's an organization whom we at LSE can enter into a subcontract with on normal UKRI terms. So somebody who understands the 0.8 FEC type structure that UKRI has. We need somebody at the other end of our contractual relationship who can absorb those structures and is willing to in turn employ the fellow on those structures. So that was the question about PhDs and experience. There's a question about, can you bring in other resources? Some people asked whether they could job share. So they have two fellows under one project. Other people are asking whether they can factor in research assistants. Both of these things are possible. I guess if you want two fellows within one project. Both of them have to be independent researchers and help shape the project. If one of them is just really your research assistant and does your data processing, then that's possible as well, but we wouldn't necessarily call that person a COP26 fellow. That would just be the fellow's research assistant. But those structures all work. There's really a lot of flexibility in terms of how you set that up. The constraint again is there's a budget constraint. We have £400,000. That's the 100% FEC, by the way. And we have £400,000. We are keen to have 5 or 4 to 6 fellowships, and somehow, ideally, we can sort of squeeze those arrangements into that sort of budget envelope. But yeah, in principle, most structures would be open to. There's a question about time frame. When should the thing start? When should it finish? The sort of natural time frame is the next academic year, the academic year 2020-2021, which just about gets you to COP26, or at least it did when we submitted the proposal, and now it's probably slightly later than that in November. But again, there's flexibility there as well. If people want to start slightly later or have slightly shorter projects, all that is possible in principle. What we will judge applications against is whether they sort of amount to a meaningful, sustained engagement with the COP26 process. We do want people to be part of the university group and be part of our interactions with the COP hosts for the duration of that pre-COP phase. So that's the test, but you can sort of structure different timeframes within that expectations that would be possible. Let me go down my list. Was there anything on the chat that I'm missing? Alyssa, if I do, let me know. Otherwise, the question of time frame we just talked about. Question of travel and accommodation if people want to go to COP26. First thing to say is I know very few researchers or non-negotiators who go to COPs for 2 weeks. That's a slightly sort of soul-destroying activity unless you're sort of an immersive researcher who just wants to sort of witness the process sort of from an academic sociological point of view. So the assumption is that our fellows will go to COP26 for a side event or maybe for a couple of side events. And we are keen that obviously fellows do engage through side events in the actual COP. And you have to, whatever you think this might cost, you have to put in your budget. Lizzie, the question about the indexation that I don't understand, can I put you on the spot?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is so applicants to the call don't need to submit their costs as indexed. So we're giving the funding to PCAN as indexed costs. So that would be a case of kind of double indexation. So you don't need to submit indexed costs. Hope that helps.
Okay. I hope some of you understood A, the question, and B, the answer. I don't pretend I did. Couple of more questions here. How long, how short should the CV be? Just send us your standard. Most academics, work on their CV on a real-time basis. So it's always up to date. Just send us that. Don't sort of try to format it in a particular way. Obviously, you want to emphasize your sort of interest in international climate negotiations and your skills in engaging with those processes, but your standard CV and whatever length and format it is will be fine. would be important to involve students. So I just missed that. I started reading that and then it went. Would it be possible to get passes for COP26? Passes to COPs are always gold dust. They're always very difficult to get. As a university network, the university network isn't accredited with the COP, so it doesn't get any passes. People would have to get passes through their host university. Most host universities are accredited observers to the UNFCCC and do get badges through that. I can tell you how it works at my university, at the LSE. There is a university and LSE-wide COP coordinator who gets approached by the UNFCCC Secretariat every year ahead of the COP, and we get a certain assignment of batches. I think the whole of LSE gets eight batches for all of us. They can be split between week 1 and week 2, so we usually manage to get sort of a dozen or so people into those 8 batches. But that is the process that will sort of apply to COP26 as well. It is possible, I don't know, Alyssa, if we tell our organizers that we would want extra batches, that they might be helpful in that, but I assume it's the normal process.
Yeah, I think at this point we have to assume it's a normal process, and you should, if you apply, it would be wise to find out if your university or institution is accredited. It is hard to get hold of passes, but I think that engaging the fellowships very closely with the Cabinet Office and the organizers of COP, and particularly because we'll be thinking about impact and how to engage. I imagine that there may be space for us to get 1 or 2 passes, but it's not something that you can assume at this point when you're writing the fellowship.
There's a question about publication costs. Lizzie, are they eligible on the normal UKRI rules?
So I think normal UKRI rules would apply to this in terms of, them not being eligible, certain publication costs not being eligible. But I might need to check the specifics on what type of publication costs are eligible, because I don't know off the top of my head. So maybe we can get back to that one in the FAQ document, if that's okay.
Yeah, that would be helpful, but basically the answer to the question is ignore what the call document says. The thing that counts is what the normal UKRI rules are. That's the bit that you should be guided by.
It would be helpful, Lizzie, I think, for you to clarify the difference between academic publications, maybe other kinds of outputs, especially as we're encouraging people to think about a wide range of engaging.
Yeah, as I understand it, the non-eligible costs are for the academic publications primarily. So it could be that other costs are eligible, but we can I can get something down in writing to confirm that.
Okay, question about start date is September 2020 too early? No, it's 2 answers to that question. Is will we finish the selection process before September? Absolutely. People should know in the course of summer, sort of in July, I think, somewhere around there is our hope to make decisions. So there's enough time to process everything to be ready by September. In terms of you want to start in September and have a project that is sort of long and lingering, that's absolutely fine. Is there a specific end date for the funding? I think, Lizzie, we said the program would end after COP, so we end of November or thereabouts is when we have to wrap everything up. Good. Let me see what else there. Let me move to my previous list. Are there any additional resources that the COP26 network can provide? Alyssa, you probably partly answered that question. In terms of financial resources, no. In terms of support, yes. But you want to elaborate maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the moment the financial resources are very limited. It's basically a voluntary network. But I think there are lots of structures and networks that we can help support, and with engagement. There's a lot of climate communications and general communications expertise in the group that I think will also be something that someone can really make use of. We have a tiny budget, as I mentioned, for producing these kind of designed briefing notes. And if something comes from a fellowship, then we may be able to put like a small amount, like £1,000, towards making that look in keeping with the style and the design brief of the rest of the group. And there are some sort of a small amount of support that will be available in terms of people. So we don't have even an official secretariat, but we do have people who can help convene or organize meetings, maybe with appropriate people and so on for you. So there'll be some of that support there.
Question in terms of support from the university, do we need a support letter? If you have one already, actually, no, I'm not. I don't think there's a way of uploading the thing. So we will check at some point in the contracting phase that you have the university support. So at that point, we will sort of need the contact of your university. So we don't need the support letter just now. We take it on trust that you don't submit fellowships that don't have your institution support. But if you don't, you will be found out once we start with the contracting and get in touch with your university. Alyssa, here's a question for you. What are the themes that sort of the pre-COP themes and priorities that the Cabinet Office is thinking about at the moment?
Okay, yeah, so they're particularly keen on, so their main themes are climate finance or green finance is one of them. There's something around clean energy transitions, but they're focusing particularly on electric vehicles and clean power. They have a focus on adaptation and resilience. They have also, in addition, sorry, I just got to check my list because I can't remember off the top of my head all of them. There are 5 themes. One second, I'll check the other ones. But in addition to the focus themes that they have that I was just describing, they also have themes that are what they call science themes as well, which aren't just natural science themes, that are all about mobilizing the science community in support of net zero. They've got something particularly on Earth observation, on communicating risk, on evidence-based policymaking. So those are, and engaging all of society in evidence. That's the broad things. I'm just checking to find the last 2 science priorities. Yeah, I've mentioned power and zero emissions. Sorry, I have to get back. You keep going, Sam, and I'll find the last 2.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
There's also we've identified a few in the call document that were sort of produced together with the Cabinet Office, while sort of Alyssa is trying to remember them, but that's just another source you can look at. There's a question here about training. Does that refer to the fellow being the trainer or the trainee? It can indeed be both. I could imagine a fellowship that sort of involves some training components of I don't know, you better know how you would want to structure that. So you could sort of have training components where the fellow is the teacher. In terms of the fellow being trained, I think Alyssa has already mentioned what the possibilities are there. We have this parallel program where we want to educate or help scientists, academics engage more effectively with policymakers on climate change, and fellows should be able to link into that. The balance between, again, going back to, is it possible to have research assistants? Yes, absolutely. Those research assistants can come from a different discipline. That's absolutely fine. And what is the balance between cost balance between the fellow and the research assistant? I don't think we have any sort of preconceived views. I don't think anybody will be turned down because the balance is wrong. What we will test is whether the fellow is engaged enough and, you know, has the willingness and the time to be part of the university group, to engage with decision makers. So put in enough time or signal that you will have enough time, even if you don't budget for it, to be a sort of a fully engaged member of the university's group. I think it's mostly the test is that people will be around and available to engage, however you split the budget. Is the Cabinet Office involved in the recruitment process? Yes, just to reiterate, we will have a panel of about 5, 6 or so people. One person will come from the COP26 office, so from the Cabinet Office, the part of government that is organizing COP26. There will be one person from there who will sort of help us evaluate the proposals. There's also somebody, as I said, my colleague Alina Vechenkova, who used to work at the UNFCCC in Bonn, at the Secretariat, who will also have an eye on the sort of the COP relevance of proposals. Is the funding range 100% FEC? It is, absolutely. That's the 100% cost. So 80% of that number, the 65 to 100, 80% of that number will be UKRI, 20% will have to come from the host institution. Normal sort of UKRI rules also in terms of estate costs and overhead costs. Good. Alyssa, have I missed anything?
No, but I was going to jump in again to say I found the one that was missing from my mind in terms of themes. So that the original 4 themes were nature. Sorry, some people in my house are making a noise. Nature-based solutions was one that I didn't mention. Obviously, there's green finance, adaptation and resilience, and clean growth, except for that clean growth has now been split kind of into these very specific areas, as I mentioned before, of electric vehicles and clean power. Oh, there we go. Yeah, Shona put them up. Thanks. Thanks, Shona, for sending them to me. But as Sam said, we're not restricting what these fellowships could be just to the government's priorities, because those priorities are very much the strategic UK government, what they want to achieve through COP. And of course, whilst as an academic community, we're happy to support them in that, we may also want to be pushing them in other directions or supplementing what they're focusing on and where we think it's too narrow. So that's an indication, but it's absolutely not a restriction. It just is a good feeling for where we can get more traction. I would also say that when we last spoke to the Cabinet Office, they also indicated that there's an underlying theme of climate change and health in a way. It's not an explicit theme, but they obviously understand that because health is predominant in everybody's mind, and a healthy recovery or a continued healthy global population is going to be a vital part of how they deliver COP, then a theme of climate change and health is something that's going to probably somehow underlie what they do in the delivery of COP. But do go back absolutely to the list that we published for this fellowship, because we thought a little bit about these different tensions and priorities when we published that list.
I think final question is about the early career researchers and just how much time we would want them to have for the engagement. Yeah, I mean, whatever your seniority, we would like people to have significant time to engage with the network, to engage with policymakers. I sort of appreciate that early career researchers tend to get landed with heavy teaching loads. Yeah, we play around with it in terms of having research assistants to help you with the actual engagement. See whether you can structure it as a buyout. I know some of the people I talk to are sort of trying to structure it as that, and in a sense the fellowship would hopefully allow you to do some of those structures. Good, and I think both our time is up, and I hope we have covered most of the questions that came from the chat box, also the questions that many of you submitted beforehand. We will, just to tell you what we will do if you missed this session. Actually, it's an omission of mine. I should have told you that we are recording it, but since none of you were sort of actively speaking, I hope you're comfortable with the fact that we recorded you. If you have problems with that, do get in touch with us. But otherwise, there's a recorded version of this document that we will put on the website, I think, or we will try to do that. There is also a written FAQ document that we have ready. We will now tweak a bit in light of the extra questions that we've just had in the past hour. That will be on the PCAN website, pcancities.org, I think is the website. So keep an eye on that. If you still have additional questions, pcan@lsc.ac.uk is the email address which you can use to ask those questions. I hope, though, that you have a good sense now what we are after, what is possible. I hope you're excited about the possibility, and I hope lots of you will submit their applications, including the 2-minute video that Alyssa wants to have from you. Okay, great. With that, let me close by thanking Lizzie and Alyssa, and thanking you all for joining this discussion this morning. Thanks, everybody, and have a good rest of the day.